It started with a letter, a simple white envelope tucked neatly into the crack of my front door, stamped with the dreaded logo of the Homeowners Association, the kind of envelope that made your stomach drop before you even opened it. The morning. Sun hadn't even burned off the dew on the grass when I stood there, coffee in hand, reading the notice that would spark one of the most bizarre neighborhood battles our cul-de-sac had ever seen. According to the HOA, my front yard was in violation of community aesthetic standards due to the unauthorized installation of multiple decorative figurines. The figurines in question were garden gnomes, 8 of them to be exact, small, colorful, harmless statues arranged neatly along the flower bed that bordered my walkway. They weren't gaudy or oversized, just a bit whimsical. Little bearded faces with cheerful smiles and pointed red hats, each one holding something different. A shovel, a lantern, a fishing rod. They had been a housewarming gift from my sister. When I bought the home a year earlier, a silly tradition that reminded me of the cottage we grew up in. To me, they were sentimental. To the HOA president, Karen Whitmore, they were an eyesore. Karen had lived across the street since the Yabai neighborhood was built. Everyone knew her. The kind of neighbor who measured grass height with a ruler and left passive-aggressive notes on windshields. Her house was spotless, her shrubs sculpted into geometric perfection, her driveway power-washed every weekend, and she ruled the HOA board like a monarch. Rumor had it she had once reported a neighbor for having mismatched flower pots. I knew it was her before I even finished reading the letter. The tone was unmistakable, formal, condescending, and dripping with the kind of superiority only someone like Karen could master. The letter cited Community Regulation 14B, which prohibited unapproved exterior decorations that disrupt neighborhood uniformity. The Gnomes, apparently, fell under that category. I was given 7 days to rectify the violation or face daily fines. I stood there in disbelief, staring at the cheerful faces of the gnomes in the flower bed, wondering how something so innocent could spark such outrage. But deep down, I also knew this wasn't about rules or aesthetics. It was about control. Karen had never liked me. Maybe it was because I didn't attend HOA meetings. Maybe it was because I didn't trim my hedges into perfect cubes like she did. Or maybe it was because I had dared to hang colorful lights on my porch the previous Christmas when the HOA had approved only white ones. Whatever the reason, this was her way of reminding me who held the power around here. For a few days, I tried to ignore it. I thought maybe if I just left things alone, the issue would blow over. But on the 3rd morning, I came outside to find one of the gnomes missing. The space where it had stood was empty, the soil disturbed. At first, I thought it might have fallen over, but after a quick search, I found it across the street, broken in 2, lying in Karen's garbage bin beside her neatly tied trash bags. My blood boiled. It wasn't just about a garden ornament anymore. It was about principle. The next day, I received a second notice. This one was harsher, threatening a fine if I didn't remove all remaining unauthorized decorations. That was when I realized this wasn't just enforcement, it was personal. Karen had made it her mission to control every inch of this neighborhood, and I had become her latest project. That night, I sat on the porch, the glow of the streetlights casting long shadows across my yard. The remaining gnomes stood silently in a row, their little painted faces turned toward the street as if waiting for what would happen next. I thought about giving in, about boxing them up and moving on. But then I remembered the way Karen had smiled smugly at the last HOA meeting when she'd bragged about having eyes everywhere. That memory lit a spark in me. No, this wasn't just about gnomes. This was about standing up to someone who had turned a neighborhood into her personal kingdom. The more I thought about it, the more it became clear that removing the gnomes wasn't an option. If I backed down now, she'd only find another excuse next time. Something else to nitpick, another rule to twist in her favor. No, I needed to fight back. but not with shouting or threats. That would only make me look like the problem. If Karen wanted a battle over aesthetics, then aesthetics she would get. That was the night the idea first came to me, an idea so ridiculous, so over the top, that it made me laugh out loud in the quiet darkness. If Karen thought my 8 gnomes were a violation, I wondered what she'd think if there were 80, or 100, or a yard so extravagant, so whimsical, that it would make her head spin. I didn't want to just annoy her. I wanted to overwhelm her with creativity, to turn her obsession with uniformity into her own undoing. Over the next few days, I started making plans. I spent hours researching online, looking for decorations, props, and lawn ornaments of every shape and style. Fairies, mushrooms, mini windmills, animal statues, birdhouses painted in neon colors. I found deals, thrift store finds, and even a few DIY projects. I measured my yard, sketching ideas and layouts like an architect of chaos. Every gnome would have company soon. Neighbors began to notice deliveries showing up at my house. Boxes of decorations, garden tools, and paint supplies. Some looked curious, others amused. Karen, however, looked increasingly nervous. She stood by her window more often, peering out as if trying to decipher what I was planning. She must have sensed that something was brewing, something she couldn't control. By the time the weekend came, I was ready. I woke early, rolled up my sleeves, and began transforming my yard. What had once been a simple flower bed was now a canvas for my rebellion. I started with a new layer of mulch, then set up clusters of figurines across the lawn. Fairies dancing in circles, tiny mushroom houses, flamingos, butterflies, and, of course, more gnomes. So many gnomes that it looked like a festival of color, and cheer had erupted overnight. By sunset, my yard had become a spectacle. The once quiet lawn was alive with decorations of every color imaginable. It was bold, bizarre, and utterly magnificent. Neighbors walked by slowly, laughing, pointing, and snapping photos. Some called it art. Others said it looked like something out of a fantasy movie. But across the street, Karen stood frozen on her porch, her face pale and expressionless, clutching her clipboard as though it were a shield. And that was only the beginning. Because while she saw chaos, I saw opportunity. What had started as petty revenge was quickly turning into something bigger, something that would change the neighborhood forever. The battle of the gnomes had only just begun, and I had no intention of losing. By the following morning, my yard had become the talk of the neighborhood. What had once been a tidy, regulation-approved front lawn now glowed with color, whimsy, and the faint scent of defiance. From the street, it looked like something straight out of a fantasy movie. Rows of gnomes lined up along winding paths, tiny fairy doors fixed to the base of trees, and little signs that read, "Welcome to Gnomeville." The effect was immediate and undeniable. Neighbors who usually drove past without a glance began to slow down, rolling their windows down just to stare. A few even parked their cars and took photos, laughing and whispering in amusement. Children tugged at their parents' hands, asking if they could come closer. The cul-de-sac, once silent and serious, buzzed with a strange, contagious energy. But, for one person, it was nothing short of a nightmare. Across the street, Karen watched from behind her pristine white curtains, her jaw clenched tight enough to crack a tooth. Every time I added something new, a garden arch, a small windmill, a painted frog statue, she'd march outside with her clipboard, take a photo, and storm back inside. She was gathering evidence. The war had entered its next phase. By noon, I received the first HOA notice. The envelope was thicker this time, packed with citations and printed photographs. "Multiple violations," it read, listing nearly every ornament in my yard as a breach of Section 14B. It warned of escalating fines if corrective measures were not taken immediately. There was even a note about creating an unapproved spectacle likely to disturb the harmony of the neighborhood. That phrase made me laugh out loud. Harmony. Karen's version of harmony meant silence, submission, and control. But this new energy, the laughter, the smiles, the kids playing on the sidewalk, this was the kind of harmony I believed in. Still, I knew Karen wouldn't stop there. That night, I saw her pacing outside with her phone, talking animatedly while pointing toward my house. She was likely reporting the matter to higher HOA officials or perhaps even the county code enforcement office. I could almost picture the conversation, her voice sharp with indignation, insisting that the entire aesthetic of the community was being threatened by a lawn full of tiny statues. But if she thought paperwork and threats would scare me into submission, she had underestimated me. I wasn't just reacting anymore, I was planning. If she wanted to make this a battle of creativity versus conformity, then I was going to escalate in ways she couldn't predict. Within days, my yard became a local sensation. A neighbor down the block posted photos on social media, tagging it Gnomeville. The post spread faster than I ever could have imagined. People from nearby streets started visiting, taking pictures, and leaving small trinkets behind. Someone even dropped off a little wooden sign that said, "Gnome, sweet gnome." It was like a movement, half joke, half rebellion. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Karen began canvassing door to door, trying to recruit others to stand up for neighborhood standards. She handed out flyers complete with photos of my yard, demanding the HOA take decisive action. A few neighbors politely nodded, but didn't sign her petition. Others avoided her altogether. Most, though, were quietly amused. They'd endured years of Karen's nitpicking, fines for mailbox paint shades, warnings for flower choices, reprimands for leaving recycling bins out too long. Now, watching her unravel was entertainment in itself. But Karen wasn't content with embarrassment. She escalated. One afternoon, I returned home to find a city code officer parked in front of my house. Karen stood beside him, arms crossed, a smug look plastered on her face. The officer walked through my yard, scribbling notes, measuring distances, and asking perfunctory questions. It turned out that Karen had filed a formal complaint, alleging that my decorations were a public nuisance. For a moment, I worried. This might actually become serious. But as the officer surveyed the scene, I noticed something shift in his demeanor. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth when he spotted the little gnome band playing plastic instruments near the walkway. When he left, he simply said everything looked fine as long as pathways weren't obstructed and the display didn't. Include electrical hazards. Karen's face turned scarlet. That night, the neighborhood group chat lit up with photos and messages of support. Someone even joked about donating a gnome in Karen's likeness. By the next weekend, more decorations started appearing, not in my yard but in others. A flamingo here, a ceramic turtle there. It was subtle at first, but the message was clear. People were done being afraid. And that's when the idea for the next phase came to me. My lawn wasn't going to stop at being colorful, it was going to become an experience. I started sketching. Plans for what I jokingly called GnomeWorld. Miniature walking paths, themed zones, maybe even a tiny fountain. A full-fledged attraction right in my front yard. Karen's fury grew with every passing day. She began calling emergency board meetings, demanding special votes, sending late-night emails to the HOA mailing list. But her desperation only fueled my resolve. I spent my evenings adding lights, painting new figurines, and constructing miniature scenes, gnomes having picnics, gnomes fishing in tiny ponds, even a gnome train running on a small track along the flower bed. The irony was rich. Karen had wanted my yard stripped bare, and now it was becoming a landmark. Cars slowed as they passed, and kids pointed from back seats with wide eyes. Some neighbors even began setting up chairs on their lawns to watch the spectacle unfold. The once silent street now buzzed with laughter, conversation, and the occasional burst of applause when I unveiled a new piece. Of course, Karen doubled down. She filed another complaint, this time citing excessive foot traffic and unregistered gatherings. When that didn't work, she started spreading rumors that I was operating a business out of my home. None of it stuck, but she kept trying, each failure only deepening her obsession. Behind her blinds, she watched day and night. I could feel her eyes on me as I worked, adjusting the lights, planting new flowers, expanding the paths. It was almost comical. The woman who had built her identity around control was watching it slip through her fingers. But I knew something she didn't. This wasn't about decorations anymore. It had become a statement, a neighborhood-wide rejection of the suffocating perfection she demanded. The HOA's rules, once absolute, now seemed laughable in the face of something that brought people joy. And just as Karen began preparing her biggest move yet, a full formal hearing before the HOA board, something happened that neither of us expected. The local news caught wind of the story. By the end of the second week, my yard had taken on a life of its own. What had started as an act of defiance had evolved into a living, breathing attraction. The lawn glimmered with solar-powered lights, winding pebble paths, guided visitors through miniature villages, and small speakers hidden among the shrubs played soft instrumental music. Every corner of the yard told a story: gnomes fishing by a tiny pond, gnomes roasting marshmallows around a fake fire pit, gnomes tending to a model vegetable garden. It was over the top, it was ridiculous, and it was magnificent. But the true turning point came one quiet morning when a white van pulled up to the curb. The logo on the side read, Channel 7 Local News. Two reporters stepped out, followed by a cameraman. Behind them, a small crowd of curious neighbors began gathering on the sidewalk, whispering and pointing. I knew instantly what was happening. Someone had tipped them off. Later, I would learn that a photo of my yard had gone viral online. A local blogger had posted pictures with the caption, HOA Crackdown Inspires Whimsical Rebellion, Meet the Man Who Built GnomeWorld. Within hours, the post had spread across social media, shared thousands of times, drawing equal parts: laughter and admiration. The news crew interviewed a few neighbors before approaching me. Though I didn't give them much more than a brief comment, they spent a good half hour filming the yard, capturing every glittering figurine and colorful path. They even shot a few clips of the sign I'd added near the walkway, hand-painted, reading, Welcome to GnomeWorld, where rules don't rule. By that evening, the story had aired during the 6 o'clock segment. It was short, but effective. A lighthearted piece that framed me as the underdog standing up against the tyranny of an overzealous HOA. They even included footage of Karen standing in her driveway, arms folded, refusing to comment. The clip of her scowling at the camera quickly became a meme online. Within days, my quiet neighborhood transformed into something unrecognizable. Cars from neighboring communities began driving through, their passengers leaning out windows to take pictures. Parents brought their kids to see the Gnome house, and I started finding small gifts left on the edge of my lawn, tiny figurines, painted rocks, and thank you notes from strangers who'd been inspired by the story. The attention infuriated Karen. She tried everything to shut it down. The HOA sent me another letter, this one worded in legal jargon, accusing me of turning my property into a commercial or promotional enterprise. But when I pointed out that I wasn't charging admission, selling merchandise, or advertising anything, their argument crumbled. Desperate, Karen escalated her campaign. She began patrolling the neighborhood in the evenings, clipboard in hand, issuing violation warnings for the smallest infractions. A garbage can left out too long, a car parked with one tire touching the grass, a door wreath that was off-season. Her crusade, meant to reassert her control, only pushed more people to my side. Before long, the neighborhood had divided into two camps, those loyal to Karen's vision of strict uniformity and those who had finally had enough. The second group was far larger. Neighbors began decorating their own yards in subtle rebellion, colorful bird baths, garden flags, even the occasional gnome of their own. The street began to change, brightening with every act of defiance. Karen called another emergency HOA meeting. She planned it for a Saturday morning, posting notices on every mailbox. The tone was aggressive, promising to address ongoing violations and restore neighborhood order. But instead of a show of authority, it became a spectacle. Half the attendees came wearing novelty gnome hats, a few even carrying small figurines under their arms. Some arrived just to see how she'd react. According to those who attended, the meeting quickly descended into chaos. Karen's voice shook as she tried to maintain control, her usual composure unraveling under the laughter, and side comments from fed-up residents. She shouted about rules, standards, and bylaws, but no one seemed to care anymore. The board members, once obedient, looked increasingly uncomfortable as they realized the crowd was no longer on Karen's side. By the end of the meeting, someone suggested putting all future fines and aesthetic restrictions to a community vote. It was an idea Karen despised but couldn't immediately suppress. Her authority, once absolute, was slipping through her fingers faster than she could tighten her grip. Meanwhile, GnomeWorld continued to evolve. I added a new section, a fantasy forest with painted stepping stones, a small archway covered in vines, and solar lanterns that glowed like fireflies at night. Children loved it. Parents snapped photos. Even a few city officials visited one weekend, quietly amused by the growing legend. But fame had its complications. The steady stream of visitors brought attention from beyond the HOA. A local newspaper ran a full feature, and soon after, a national blog picked up the story, dubbing it the Great Gnome Rebellion. That's when Karen's real nightmare began. Emails started flooding the HOA's inbox. Strangers from across the country mocked their obsession with control, calling them the Gnome Police and the Fun Killers. Some even mailed plastic gnomes to the HOA's P.O. box. The story had become bigger than either of us. It was no longer about one yard or one neighborhood. It was about a universal frustration with petty authority. Karen, humiliated, tried to salvage her image. She released a carefully worded public statement claiming she supported creativity within reason, but was concerned about the long-term impact on property values. The internet wasn't kind. Her words were dissected, memed, and ridiculed. The narrative had escaped her control. But as the world laughed, I noticed something else happening within the neighborhood itself. People began talking to each other, again. The fences that had once divided us emotionally now felt less like barriers. Kids from different houses played together on the sidewalks, parents chatted over coffee while watching them, and small clusters of laughter replaced the old silence. Karen's reign of order had created a neighborhood of isolation. My rebellion had accidentally built a community. Still, I knew it wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. Her pride was too sharp, her need for control too deep, and true to form, she struck back in a way that caught everyone off guard. It happened one evening as I returned home to find a bright orange notice staked into my front lawn. It wasn't from the HOA this time. It was from the city, a notice of zoning violation. Karen had taken the war beyond the neighborhood. The city notice stood like a scar in the grass, bright, bold, and impossible to ignore. It was official. I had been accused of violating local zoning ordinances by allegedly operating an unregistered attraction on residential property. The notice demanded that I cease and desist all public exhibition activity until further investigation. It cited sections and subsections of obscure municipal codes, none of which I had ever heard of before. The first emotion that hit me wasn't fear. It was disbelief. I had never charged a dime, never advertised my yard as a business. The attention had come on its own, uninvited and organic. Yet somehow, Karen had twisted it into something the city couldn't ignore. Over the following days, inspectors came, by unannounced. They carried clipboards, took photos, and made notes about everything: the number of decorations, the lights, the pathways. They even measured distances between lawn ornaments as though I were constructing a theme park ride. Neighbors peeked out from behind curtains as the officials walked the property, whispering about what was happening. Karen watched from across the street, arms folded, her expression smug and satisfied. She believed this was the final blow, the one that would shut me down for good. But something had changed in the neighborhood since all this began. I wasn't the only one angry about what she'd done. Word spread quickly that the HOA president had reported me to the city, and the community's mood shifted from amusement to outrage. The same neighbors who once stayed silent during her endless rule were now standing up, speaking out, and organizing. Within 48 hours, someone created a Facebook group called Save GnomeWorld. It started with a dozen members, then ballooned to hundreds as residents from nearby neighborhoods joined in. People began sharing photos, memories, and messages of support. They called my yard a symbol of joy and a protest against control. When the city held a public hearing to determine whether my display violated zoning laws, I walked into the municipal building expecting a handful of people. Instead, the room was packed. Parents with kids, elderly residents with walking canes, teenagers holding handmade signs that said things like, "Let the gnomes stay," and "Freedom of expression matters." Even the local news showed up again, their cameras capturing every angle of the confrontation. Karen sat in the front row, dressed in her trademark pastel cardigan, clutching a folder of printed complaints. She looked calm, too calm, as though she'd already prepared her victory speech. The city official presiding over the hearing began reading the complaint in a monotonous tone. He listed supposed violations: excessive decorative displays, pedestrian traffic, potential safety hazards due to footpaths and lighting. Then came the question, was GnomeWorld a private garden, or had it become a public attraction in violation of zoning laws? When my turn came, I explained everything as plainly as possible. The decorations were on my property. The paths were safe, the lights solar-powered. I never promoted or profited from the display. It was art. Nothing more. Nothing less. And art, I argued, was not a crime, but I didn't have to defend myself alone. One by one, my neighbors stood to speak. A mother talked about how her daughter, who had been shy and lonely, found joy visiting the gnome garden and made her first friends there. An elderly man shared how the display reminded him of his late wife's love for whimsy and beauty. Another neighbor said that before GnomeWorld, people barely spoke to each other. But now, they did. Their words filled the room with emotion, transforming what could have been a cold legal hearing into something deeply human. The official listened, quietly, occasionally glancing toward Karen, whose face grew paler with each testimony. After nearly 2 hours of statements, the board recessed to deliberate. The crowd waited in tense silence. Cameras rolled. Karen avoided everyone's gaze, pretending to scroll on her phone. When the officials returned, the verdict was simple but powerful. No violation. The city had determined that my display did not constitute a business or attraction, and that I was within my rights to decorate my property as I saw fit, provided it didn't block sidewalks or impede public access. The room erupted in applause. People hugged, children cheered. The victory was small on paper but monumental in spirit. Karen slipped out before anyone could confront her, but her absence didn't go unnoticed. Neighbors began to murmur, realizing how much time, effort, and taxpayer money she had wasted on a vendetta that ultimately failed. That night, GnomeWorld shone brighter than ever. I added a new centerpiece, a large gnome holding a tiny scroll that read, "Certified by the city." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Visitors laughed as they passed by, and for the first time, even those who had been indifferent to the situation came to see what all the fuss was about. But beneath the celebration, I sensed that Karen wasn't done. People like her didn't stop after a single loss. Their need for control was bottomless, their obsession with order relentless. And though she'd been humiliated publicly, she wouldn't disappear quietly. Over the next few weeks, she retreated into silence, too silent. Her usual patrols stopped. No more angry letters, no more HOA emails. It was eerie, like the calm before a storm. Then one evening I noticed something odd. A white SUV, unfamiliar to the neighborhood, parked in front of my house for nearly an hour. Two people inside took notes, occasionally pointing at my yard. The next day, another car did the same. I could feel eyes on me, not from curious neighbors this time, but from something more official. It didn't take long to find out the truth. Karen had contacted a private law firm specializing in community compliance and property value litigation. She was preparing a civil lawsuit, not through the HOA, but personally. Her claim? That my yard had devalued neighboring homes, caused emotional distress, and created a hostile environment. The fight wasn't over. It had only evolved. Still, she underestimated one thing: the power of public opinion. The community that once feared her now stood firmly against her. And as I soon discovered, when people rally together against tyranny, even petty suburban tyranny, they can turn the tide completely. The war for GnomeWorld was about to enter its final and most dramatic stage. The lawsuit hit like a thunderclap. A thick envelope landed in my mailbox one morning, its contents crisp and formal. Karen versus me. Her complaint was pages long, filled with exaggerated claims and dramatic language. According to her attorney, my property had become a spectacle, disrupting the peaceful aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood. She accused me of causing traffic congestion, noise pollution, and even, absurdly, psychological strain from having to see the gnomes every day. Reading it felt surreal. It wasn't just a personal attack. It was a performance. Every word screamed of someone desperate to reassert dominance after losing control. The fine print demanded compensation for damages to her home's property value and emotional well-being, a sum so large it bordered on parody. Still, I couldn't ignore it. Lawsuits had weight no matter how ridiculous, and Karen, ever strategic, had chosen her moment well. She knew that legal battles were draining, not just financially, but mentally. Her plan was simple. If she couldn't beat me with HOA rules or city ordinances, she'd bury me in paperwork and fear. But this time, she miscalculated. The story spread faster than she could control. The news outlets that had once covered GnomeWorld as a quirky local story returned with a vengeance. Headlines appeared everywhere. HOA president sues neighbor over garden gnomes. Suburban feud escalates into legal circus. Social media exploded with outrage. People shared the story, tagging Karen's HOA and calling her out by name. Online forums and neighborhood groups buzzed with disbelief. Memes flooded the internet. Karen's stern face photoshopped beside angry gnomes holding "We won't be silenced" signs. What she intended as a private act of control became a public spectacle that consumed her image. Within days, strangers began donating to a GoFundMe started by one of my neighbors to help with legal costs. It was humbling, seeing hundreds of messages from people across the country who'd never met me, but knew exactly what it felt like to deal with petty authority. The page's title summed it up perfectly. Support the Gnome Guy, because joy shouldn't be illegal. The donations didn't just cover legal fees, they became a symbol of unity. People mailed postcards, artwork, and even handmade gnome figurines, each carrying a note of encouragement. The yard became more than just decoration. It was a rallying ground. Karen, on the other hand, began to unravel. Her once carefully crafted image of control and composure fell apart under scrutiny. Old HOA members started distancing themselves. Some resigned altogether, unwilling to be associated with her crusade. Former allies whispered to reporters about her temper, her obsession with perfection, her endless need to dominate every decision. The more she tried to defend herself, the worse it got. In interviews, she spoke about maintaining standards, but her tone dripped with condescension. She couldn't hide her disdain for the very people she claimed to represent. When the first court date arrived, the courthouse parking lot was full, not just with lawyers and reporters, but with supporters. Families, retirees, and even a few curious onlookers stood outside holding signs that read, "Let the gnomes be free, and no one owns joy." Inside, Karen sat stiffly beside her lawyer, avoiding eye contact with anyone. I sat across from her, my attorney, a kind, level-headed woman who believed in standing up to bullies, calmly preparing her notes. The proceedings were supposed to be formal, but they quickly took on an almost absurd tone. Karen's lawyer argued that my decorations caused mental anguish by disrupting the visual harmony of the community. He presented printed photos of the yard as evidence of excessive whimsy. The judge, an older man with tired eyes, seemed to be suppressing a smirk as he flipped through the glossy images of smiling gnomes. My attorney countered with facts. No noise complaints, no property damage, no proof of devaluation. She cited freedom of expression laws and local precedents for decorative displays. She even presented letters from neighbors supporting the yard, including one from the local tourism board, which had unofficially listed GnomeWorld as a unique cultural feature. By the end of the hearing, it was clear who the judge believed. When his decision came 2 weeks later, it was decisive, case dismissed. He described Karen's lawsuit as frivolous and vindictive, noting that it appeared to serve no purpose, other than harassment. He even ordered her to pay my legal fees. The neighborhood erupted with laughter and relief. The same night, my neighbors threw a spontaneous block party in my driveway. Someone brought a cake shaped like a gnome. Kids ran around waving glow sticks and music filled the air. It felt like a celebration of something bigger than just one victory. It was the moment the neighborhood reclaimed its spirit. Karen, meanwhile, vanished from public view. Her house sat dark most evenings, blinds drawn tight. Rumors spread that she was being pressured to resign from the HOA board entirely. A few members even suggested dissolving the association altogether, tired of its toxic reputation. But even as the dust settled, I couldn't shake a quiet unease. People like Karen rarely vanished quietly. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy. And I had a feeling there was one more move left on her board. A few weeks later, my suspicion proved right. An envelope appeared on every doorstep in the neighborhood. It wasn't from the HOA this time, but from Karen herself. Inside was a letter, neatly typed, claiming she was stepping down for personal reasons, but warning that the community was losing its identity to chaos and disorder. Her words carried the same venom as always, veiled, passive-aggressive, dripping with self-righteousness. But this time, no one cared. The letter became another punchline. Some neighbors even framed it as a souvenir of her downfall, and just like that, Karen's reign ended not with applause or redemption, but with indifference. The HOA held an election to fill her position. To my surprise, several neighbors nominated me. I hadn't planned to accept. I'd fought to be free of this nonsense, not to lead it. But as I looked around at the community that had banded together, the laughter echoing down the street and the gnome lights glowing softly in the dusk, I realized something important. If people like Karen could twist power for control, then maybe people like me could use it for change. I accepted the nomination, and that's when the story of GnomeWorld entered its final chapter. Not of rebellion, but of rebuilding. The HOA election came and went in a blur. What was once a symbol of control and fear transformed into a moment of unity. For the first time in years, people showed up in record numbers, not because they feared fines or reprimands, but because they wanted to have a say. They wanted change. They wanted peace. When the votes were tallied, my name sat at the top. I was officially the new HOA president. It felt strange. Standing in the same position Karen had used to terrorize the community, now holding the power she had once wielded so mercilessly. But I knew from the start that I wouldn't use it the way she had. Power, I realized, wasn't inherently corrupt. It was simply shaped by the hands that held it. My first act as president was simple. I rewrote the HOA charter. Gone were the endless pages of petty restrictions about lawn ornaments, fence heights, and acceptable car colors. Gone were the clauses that allowed board members to fine homeowners without a community vote. I replaced the rigid framework with one built on mutual respect and reasonable standards, guidelines meant to protect safety and property, not stifle individuality. The board meetings that followed were nothing like Karen's reign. People brought ideas instead of complaints. Neighbors laughed, shared snacks, and even volunteered to organize seasonal events. The neighborhood, once divided by suspicion and fear, began to feel like a true community again. But Karen's shadow lingered, an unspoken reminder of how easily one person's obsession with control could poison an entire place. She had vanished from sight after her resignation, rarely seen outside her house. Her once pristine yard grew neglected, the grass uneven, the shrubs overgrown. It was as though the energy she once poured into enforcing order had drained completely from her life. Still, rumors swirled. Some said she was planning to move. Others claimed she was quietly lobbying former HOA members to restore her influence. I didn't pay much attention, until one morning, a letter arrived in the HOA's official mailbox. It was from Karen. The envelope was thick and perfumed, sealed with a perfect flourish. Inside, the message was brief but cutting. She accused me of dismantling years of progress, of turning a respectable neighborhood into a circus, and of encouraging an environment of chaos under the guise of freedom. She signed it, with concern for our community, Karen M. There was no threat this time, no lawsuit, no demand, just bitterness. I read it once, folded it neatly, and filed it away, not as evidence, but as history, a final footnote in a story that had already moved past her. Over the next few months, the transformation of the neighborhood continued. The once colorless lawns now bloomed with creativity, wind chimes, murals, small sculptures, and flower beds in every hue. People took pride in expressing themselves, not because they were rebelling, but because they finally felt free to do so. GnomeWorld became the centerpiece of it all. What started as a symbol of defiance evolved into a community landmark. Families from nearby areas still visited on weekends. During holidays, the neighbors helped decorate it, stringing up lights, adding themed displays, and hosting small fundraisers for local charities. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The very thing Karen had tried to erase had become the heart of the neighborhood. The local newspaper ran a follow-up story titled, "From Feud to Fellowship: How One Man's Gnomes Saved a Community." Reporters described how the neighborhood, once known for strict HOA enforcement, had become a model for collaboration and creativity. Even the mayor sent a congratulatory letter, praising the residents for turning conflict into connection. And then, one afternoon, Karen returned. I saw her standing at the edge of my yard, just beyond the welcome sign that now read, "Harmony. Hills, home of GnomeWorld." She looked smaller somehow, her posture slouched, her once sharp expression dulled by exhaustion. For a long moment, She simply stared at the display that had once been her greatest frustration. Her eyes moved across the gnomes, the little fishing one by the pond, the one holding the certified by the city scroll, and the newest addition, a gnome sitting on a wooden bench, holding a sign that said, "Peace begins here." I watched from my porch, silent as she took it all in. Then, without a word, she turned and walked away. That was the last time I ever saw her. A "for sale" sign appeared on her lawn 2 weeks later, and within a month, she was gone. The house sold quickly, ironically at a higher price than expected, thanks to the neighborhood's newfound charm and positive press. Her departure felt like the closing of a chapter, not just for me, but for everyone. The neighborhood no longer needed a villain to unite against. It had found its balance again, not through rules or restrictions, but through shared laughter and respect. As seasons changed, the story of GnomeWorld faded from headlines but lived on in spirit. Each spring, neighbors added a new gnome to the yard as a tradition, a symbol of unity and humor. By the end of the first year, there were over 200 of them, each one unique, each one placed with love. Sometimes, when I looked at them, all lined up under the warm glow of the setting sun, I thought back to how it all started, with one petty complaint from one controlling neighbor. It amazed me how something so small, a simple act of rebellion, could spark something so big. Gnomes were no longer just decorations. They were reminders that peace doesn't come from control. It comes from acceptance, kindness, and the courage to stand up for joy when someone tries to take it away. And as night fell and the lights twinkled across the lawn like tiny stars, I realized that GnomeWorld had never really been about revenge. It was about freedom, about community, about finding beauty where someone else only saw imperfection. And though Karen's name was long forgotten, the message remained etched in every smile, every light, and every gnome. That sometimes, the best way to fight control is to build something so joyful that no one can destroy it.